It gives me great pleasure now to welcome the Chief Economic Advisor of Government of India, Mr. K.V. Subramanian. Mr. Subramanian, fantastic to connect with you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining us for the Birla Voyage 2020. I've been told this is the biggest financial voyage, so we are quite excited to have you on the show. Now, the Prime Minister has already announced the big package, but in last 2 days, what we've heard from the Finance Minister is the blueprint and the fine parts are not really focused around direct spending. Do you think there is yet more to come, or this package in a sense has been designed considering the fiscal constraints?
Good afternoon, Nikunj, and good afternoon to all the participants. I'm glad to be here sharing my thoughts with all of you. I think firstly, when we understand the package that has been announced, the package needs to be seen in the light of a new vision that has been articulated by the Honorable Prime Minister. And in some sense, there is an attempt to try and construct, something equivalent of a New Deal that President Roosevelt came up with after during the Great Depression. And, not only was there measures in terms of, monetary, fiscal, and liquidity, etc. then, but more importantly, there were a bunch of reforms as well. And reforms with the vision of a self-reliant India, or Atmanirbhar Bharat. Maybe later I can give some color, in terms of, as an economist, how I think about self-reliant India, because oftentimes people can always, mistake it to be equivalent to be something from the past, which is not what it is intended to be. Given that vision, and given the pandemic, there is basically value to the package, and the package is it's constructed based on the following principle. If we think about from first principles, if we think about the effect of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, it is a war-like situation, but it is different from a war, because in a war, what happens is demand suffers because of uncertainty. For instance, when a war is going on, people will not travel that much. Tourism, for instance, takes a beating. A lot of discretionary or non-essential items, those basically do not get consumed as much. There is a demand side impact. But in a war, what also happens is there are huge supply side disruptions because factories get bombed, factories basically just get converted into rubble, and that creates permanent disruptions on the supply side. In contrast, in the case of the COVID, there are supply side disruptions, but these are not permanent because no factory is basically getting sort of just getting reduced to a rubble. What you have is a situation where the hands are not there on the machines yet, and there is basically that temporary impact on the supply side. Therefore, if you think about it, compared to a situation like a war, what needs to happen is a lot more focus needs to be on temporary liquidity, so that firms can tide over their difficulties, so that temporary inconveniences and temporary distress that firms are facing does not create permanent damage. That is one very, very important aspect on the supply side intervention. On the demand side as well, especially those where there are essential items, those have been worked on. More importantly, the demand side impact also can manifest if you have people, losing their jobs in significant numbers. Then, obviously they will not have the disposable income to spend, and in which case then you will have, the significant demand side impact. So if you think about the demand side measures itself, it is in one way, one is basically trying to reduce the impact on, any detrimental impact on unemployment. And here it is important to remember not only India, but globally. For instance, if you take the United States, the number of people filing for unemployment insurance in the United States is now at a historical high, even greater than that during the Great Depression. And so this is something that is a first order issue that every country has to grapple with by ensuring that supply side concerns and liquidity concerns of firms do not lead to retrenchment of people. You are thereby also having a demand side impact by basically retaining demand in some sense by retaining the disposable income. Second, also those people who are less likely to be affected to basically become unemployed, their disposable income has been increased through not only the automatic stabilizers, what we economists call as automatic stabilizers because of the tax part, but there's also been the reduction in the PPF rates, the reduction in basically some of the holidays that have been given. All these also then end up putting disposable income in the hands of consumers. So that's how the measures have been basically thought about. So the reason, and I think at this point it is also good for me to compare with other countries. We've been, for instance, ever since March itself, we've been studying each country's package threadbare. One of the big takeaways for us has been that countries have employed different portfolio of fiscal, monetary, and liquidity measures depending on where they had greater space. And India has done the same as well. If you take between the fiscal and the monetary side, and on the liquidity as well, we clearly had more space on the monetary side. And given that we have a lot of state-owned institutions as well, by giving them some capital or through a guarantee, etc., we can leverage and have far significant impact without necessarily constraining our fiscal side too much, because there's also the concern of possible impact on the ratings, etc., which is why I had actually also mentioned in one of my comments that there is no free lunch. It is important to keep in mind. So I think eventually, if you look at the policy package that has been brought in, it's a smart combination of the fiscal, liquidity and monetary, by keeping in mind where we have greater space. And that's what the other important part also is, there is, if you look at, from a macroeconomic point of view, when you give freebies versus when you basically give people, sort of retain their ability to contribute, right? The latter is always a better idea. For instance, and this is research in macroeconomics shows that when you give freebies, that can make people lazy and thereby, in the long run, medium to long run, shrink supply because people may not produce enough. So, but when you give freebies does enhance demand. So if you have a situation of increasing demand but supply shrinking, that can have inflationary impact. But if you actually don't give freebies and instead enhance productive capacity or retain productive capacity, I think at this point in time, given the COVID episode, it's far more important to retain productive capacity as much as possible by alleviating some of the temporary troubles that I spoke about. So which can thereby ensure that there aren't as many supply side disruptions, so that inflationary pressures don't build up. So this is sort of in some sense, some of the core principles that have guided the stimulus package.
Economists and financial commentators, we love to analyze every line, what the CEA has to say and what the finance minister has to say. I'm going to keep that analysis aside, but talk about big picture, a question which you've not been asked before. I'm sure because of this crisis, the shape of the economy will change, and it is bound to change. Whenever things will normalize, how do you think the shape of the economy, at least in India, will change?
So, Nikunj, I have, even in normal times, I've always been careful about, giving a prognosis on the future. And especially during times like this, everybody has to be extremely careful because we are dealing with a situation of unknown unknowns. And so anybody's assessment, including mine or, someone else, it's important to keep in mind that there is going to be uncertainty. It's as if, even a Wasim Akram, if he's bowling on a bad pitch, the ball how will it behave? Actually, even Wasim Akram cannot necessarily predict. Some balls may just basically shoot through, just and not rise at all, and some balls may really, sort of rise to, let's say, to the, bounce a lot. So that's the kind of situation we are in, and that's why I want to sort of mention that caveat. With that caveat in mind, and I think whenever participants take into account what I'm talking, they should not just focus on what I'm saying as my prediction, but keep in mind the uncertainty that I've actually talked about. That nuance is very important. With that preamble, now let me say what are, I think, the important changes that will happen in the economy. I think, for one, the sectoral, allocation between services, manufacturing, agriculture, that may actually also have an impact. And I think from India's perspective, this possibly is a good opportunity to do a reset and enhance the scope of manufacturing in the economy, because unlike services, where the social distancing sort of puts some question marks on some very key service sectors, because compared to manufacturing, services is a sector which relies a lot more interpersonal interactions. Therefore, this COVID episode, for the time that it lasts, it's likely to have a greater impact on service sector than on manufacturing. And because we are a population that has a large number of youth who need jobs, manufacturing is that outlet that can generate jobs. Together with companies that are actually in China, many of whom who want to relocate. So this these are some of the sort of favorable conditions that are coming together for India to reset and actually increase its its presence in manufacturing in terms of globally, but also within the country itself to have far more manufacturing presence and thereby create jobs. So that's, I think, number one key change that I foresee. Second, as you would have seen, today you must have read about the Department of Personnel in the government, thinking about 15 days of work from home, for government employees. Now, this is having now been in government for almost 1.5 years. I think it's a very big mindset change. Oftentimes status quo is one thing that tends to be a lot more likely to be perpetuated in any government, be it in India or anywhere else, actually. And so this is an important change, and it signals the fact that the way we work is also quite likely to change, not only within the government, but also in the private sector as well. For instance, in my own team, I have always maintained that as long as you produce the output, I don't care, if you're someone who's actually really smart, you work for 6 hours and you actually produce very high quality output, good for you. I don't care about, quote unquote, impression management, that you keep showing me that you're basically, inefficient. So, that you basically put in a lot of hours and don't necessarily, let's say, produce enough output. So I can actually foresee now that, many more people will think along the same lines, that, I don't care whether you're actually working from home or you're working from office, as long as you're able to actually produce the deliverables that are required, that are expected, I am fine with you. So I think this thinking is likely to increase more, and thereby generate a greater push for work from home. That's a second. A third key thing, I think, is if you look at, and of course, what I'm going to speak about has come with its costs, but the pandemic and thereby the lockdown is by far the best natural experiment on how too much economic activity can basically have a detrimental effect on the climate, for instance. I think, and if you think about the Ganges, for instance, I've seen pictures of Ganges in Varanasi being so clean, almost water has become potable, right? and that has happened because industrial effluents that used to go into the into the Ganges are not happening, and therefore despite all the effort that actually various governments have put in over decades, which couldn't achieve this outcome, just the fact that we basically industrial effluents were not poured into the Ganges has made that very clean. So and similarly, people in the plains, for instance, in Jalandhar, have been able to see the Himalayas, for instance. So this is a third aspect, which is I think left to ourselves, humanity would not have had the courage to be able to do this natural experiment. But because it was forced on us, and thereby we've been able to see the benefits that has come. Now, I actually am very much empathetic to the economic costs that it imposes, which I'm, and we need to do much about it. But I would also say that I think there can't be a better way, as they say, the proof of the pudding lies in the eating. And this particular, natural episode has provided that proof of the pudding, and thereby made the case that maybe some scaling down of economic activity, not necessarily across the board, but those that actually affect our climate very, very detrimentally, may be something that we can think about. I think broadly these are three key. From an Indian perspective, I would also say this is a matter of point of view. There are people who look at every crisis as an opportunity, and there are people who basically look at a crisis as only a crisis. And I can confidently say that the Honorable Prime Minister, looks at a crisis as an opportunity. To see someone who's looking for solutions to problems, and this is in some sense, in 1991, the then Prime Minister, Narasimha Rao, utilized that crisis to actually be able to push through reforms which would have not happened in normal times. And similarly, now I think we are, and people have read about it, about the labor reforms, about the land reforms. Karnataka, for instance, APMC, which is a important product market reform that we basically that several states are embarking on, which may not have happened in normal times. And this is the other thing that actually I would mention, is that it's possible we can recalibrate a little bit here and there, but the crisis provides an opportunity, because especially when I talk about from the Indian labor's perspective, right? Now, Indian labor is not just the 11% that works in the formal sector. Indian labor also includes the 89% that works in the informal sector. And here I actually will use a parallel. I have, I would say now looking back, had the privilege of traveling in a third-class compartment in a railway train. And one of the things that stands out is, whoever gets into that third-class compartment at the origin station, they are the only ones that get the space. These quarters are their rights. So nobody else in any other station can get into the third-class compartment, because those who are inside end up preventing anybody else coming in. The situation with our labor force is also very similar. The 11% are those that are basically inside that compartment and are managing to reach their destination. They have the privilege. But there's an 89% that also wants inclusion, economic and social inclusion, by having a formal sector job. And the squatters basically in some sense are not providing them that opportunity. So this is a very important aspect, and when you look at it from the perspective of migrant labor as well, migrant labor is, after all, a very important part of the informal sector labor. And on the one hand, we cannot be shedding tears for migrant labor, and on the other hand, not doing enough in removing the obstacles that basically, that we've had for 7 decades now, in generating enough employment. So I think from India's perspective, while there will be short-term troubles, and the government is trying its very best to alleviate these troubles, I also look at this as an opportunity, and hopefully we will basically go and we'll be seizing.
The challenge for the economy right now is confidence of a crisis in terms of lending. RBI has done a fantastic job of bringing liquidity back. Banks have surplus liquidity. Banks are saying we want to lend, but we have to be cognizant of risk and NPAs. Now, government cannot force banks to lend. That's not the right thing. Government is doing their bit by letting MSCs borrow. But is that enough? Because when I speak to bankers, they're not scared, but they are worried. When I speak to RBI is astonished that why banks are not lending. The system has got jammed. It's fear or something else, I don't know. So what can be done?
No, in fact, actually, see, Nikunj, this was one of the key things that we incorporated into the design of the package. If you pay, careful attention to the, to the 20% extension of working capital and term loans, 3 lakh crores of it through the MSMEs. What we did is we basically have given 100% guarantee on it, which means basically the bank does not face any risk at all. The bank is, effectively the bank can price it like a risk-free loan because the entire loss on it is borne by the guaranteeing corporation, which itself has been provided, the capital by the government. So in this case, the risk aversion, which is what is holding bankers back, which is why they're sitting on 8.5 lakh crores of, of basically reverse repo money with the RBI. Now, 3 lakh crores of that can actually be put into the MSMEs, and 3 lakh out of 8.5 lakh crores is almost like 45%. So, and by making it completely, risk-free, and this is something I can actually share with you. We had, deliberations on it initially saying, what if we basically have, let's say, first loss guarantee for 25%, 30%, etc. And when we were thinking about this, and then we felt that, if we don't give 100% guarantee, then even with a small residual risk, it's possible that banks basically may feel skittish in lending. And so it is really critical for us to actually, have that 100% guarantee. And so this particular fear, we've taken it on, front on in designing it. So, and this is for every SME, MSME that has borrowed from a bank. And by the way, I was looking at some tax return data to look at how many, what percentage of MSMEs are covered in this, under the new definition. So if you look at the tax, the corporate tax return data, 98% of the filers have a turnover less than 75 crores.
Closing comments. How has life changed for you personally? All of us are working from home.
For me, I think the hard part has been staying all alone and staying away from family, especially at a time when I hear my friends saying, oh, we actually, Sunday evening, we watched a movie together. And, I think that's one, but to be honest, actually the privilege of getting to contribute, at a time like this is also something. I mean, there are always costs to these things. So, but that's one of the key changes that has happened. I used to, go once in 2-3 weeks to Hyderabad for the weekend. And that I haven't been able to do. So that's how my life has changed. But I think these have been very, in some sense, therefore, I have actually been working almost all my waking hours. So, and that's a class as hard